So there's an article on your table. I didn't do enough for everybody, so you'll have to fight over these. But it's called Three Primary Loyalties. It's out of a book I have not yet published on Psalm 128. But I'm going to say something off the article. In my role in the Christian community, the biggest problem I see is the opposite of what you usually hear when people preach. I would say the biggest problem is we're not selfish enough. So you usually don't see the gospel taught that way because it's usually we're too self-centered, that we're not self-centered, or we're too self-centered and not centered on Christ enough. But what you see in the Christian community, especially with people in service, is they organize around God and others and they neglect themselves. So, and we hardly ever think about that being a sin. But if you don't pay attention to your own needs and your own emotions and take care of them, then you're in trouble. So that's one of the most difficult things that I see regularly, and I'm kind of unscripting people in terms of their theology. Because they'll say, well, you mean I should be more selfish? And we usually don't use those terms, but in terms of the three primary loyalties of the great commands, we're to love the Lord, say it with me, we love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. So your three primary loyalties are God, self, and others. Self gets left out. Now everybody here, I'm not picking on you guys, but you're old enough to know these things. So I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit on it, but I have four things that I'm just going to throw out in terms of really what brings burnout or causes people to move in a direction of not having self-care. Glenn Elliott's going to share some of his story in a little while. We're going to just do two speakers today and more interaction at your tables. And Glenn's got some great thing. The last time I did a presentation on this, Glenn got up and shared, and I said, you have to share your life and what you do on this. But what happens, we were talking before, what happens is people don't pay attention to the issues of burnout. This is mainly the faith community, but any type of work will put demands on you. Family, I think God puts demands on us. We don't want to vilify him, but there's a lot of demands in Scripture. Church, community, there's a whole lot of areas that put demands on us. Are you up? You are. Good job. Okay, I have some cartoons to lighten this up because this is a heavy talk. So here's the first cartoon. You didn't know those are your first demands in the morning, did you? Okay, second cartoon. Okay, family is oftentimes one of our support systems, but we don't talk to our spouses about how demanding they are. It says, not only is this good exercise for Bob, it's also great entertainment for the kids. So I'm going to run through these without doing a lot of them. One of the ones that we don't think about is constant threat. The hardest thing in the Christian community is saying to people, you have anxiety, you're just not acknowledging it. Oftentimes they're threatened, but they're not acknowledging the threat or the anxiety. It says, actually, this is my son, the pastor. Dan Johnson, would you stand and talk to us about that? Dan is retired, so we can poke fun at him at this point in time. Okay, next one. So this is my favorite one. This is a blender, two fish in the blender, and says, I can't stand the tension. So many of us live in that type of a fishbowl where there's constant threat on it. And so as we're doing this, if you want to write on your own sheet, what are these in your own life? Because you're going to discuss them at your table. What are the demands? What are the threats? The biggest issue in terms of stress is loss. So losses are huge in terms of this. Go ahead, Kat. So this says, I can't read it, it's too close. It says, this to make you feel very secure in an airplane if they lost their contact lenses, right? Yeah, that's right. Larson's a little sick on some of his stuff. So, Kat, okay, yeah, careers in broadcasting at the NFL knee injury clinic. So it's sort of funny, but when I was in sports in college, this is what the training room looked like. Everybody was in there recovering from injuries and thinking about what they're going to do after being in sports. And I give you one more. Kat, lack of meaningful reward. Now I'm going to throw one thing at you, especially for the pastors. One of the things that happens with rewards is meaningful means that they're subjective. So oftentimes what we think is rewarding to a person is not. In fact, it may just put more pressure on them. So to do well in terms of nurturing people, protecting them, doing soul care, we have to know what means something to a person. If you don't take the time to find out who they are and what it means, you're not going to reward them very well. You want to do the next one? So this is one of my favorite marriage ones. It says, I'm sorry, I can't cope with that now. And he's full of gifts. Next one, Kat. It says, this is not what I had in mind when I said I wanted to add a master bathroom. Okay, so I want you to think about those in terms of your own life. Some of you, one of the big stressors is people feel trapped. They often feel trapped because what they're into is not very rewarding. It's hard for Christians to admit that part of selfishness. I need something that's rewarding for me. I think it relates to our walk with the Lord that He loves us, He knows us, He made us who we are, but it's very hard a lot of times for people to admit they need what they need. So, okay, next one. So these are the definitions of entropy and negaentropy. I'm too close to this, but entropy says the tendency of things to go into disorder. Negaentropy, the ability of things to interact with the environment and its resources and build increasingly ordered structures within their boundaries. Mission work. This is church work, business work. Everything that we do, we're taking energy from outside sources and putting it in and building something. We don't usually talk in these terms in Christendom, but this is how it works. So everything has entropy in it. We would call it the devil. He's always at work to steal and destroy, right? When we're building something, we have to do negaentropy. We have to take energy. We use God as source oftentimes for energy, and then we have to build. And if we don't build, we get deterioration. Okay, Kat, next one. So in all systems, you have demands and burdens, and then you have resources and capacities. And when Glenn shares his talk, you'll get a little bit of a picture of this. You have to have resources in the systems that you're in. Many, many systems have much greater demands than they have resources. So you're in trouble. And families work this way. As a family therapist, you oftentimes see this. As families do not have resources, and they have tremendous demands, and they're dysfunctional and coming apart at the seams. So this is a day seminar in 10 minutes or 15 minutes or something, but individuation is one of the ones that the Christian community has a hard time with. Here's the definition. I wrote it out this time. The ability to self-define and function in the face of disapproval without losing a relationship. What you usually see in the Christian community, if you know somebody's not going to approve of you, you distance out or don't do what would be disapproved of. So one of the reasons we're low functioning as a community is because of poor individuation. You have to be able to tell people who you are and what you need, and sometimes take care of yourself in the face of disapproval. My best pastors that I've worked with over the years are fairly selfish. They can self-define without being too nervous about it. They're not really dependent on other people's approval. But they also have to have a system that can adjust. You have to be fairly healthy to adjust to somebody's selfishness. If you can't do that, you're going to lack intimacy as well as individuation. Okay. So this is one of my cartoons. My first book was called Compassion Fatigue that was published, and it says, "Why am I so great at saying yes?" Anybody feel that way in this group? You guys are liars. So part of it is, as Christians, we're taught that one of our highest values is service, but it's hard to get out of this. Like one of my stressors this week is Cherie's not here, but she has kids camp. So they have 200 Muslim kids, 240 signed up for camp this week. So they couldn't find a guitar player. So Cherie's under my organization, Community Renewal. So she calls me and she goes, "Will you play guitar?" I said, "I haven't done worship in 100 years. No comments, Dick. And she goes, "I can't find anybody else." I said, "Okay, I'll do it." So I've been doing worship for kids this week early in the morning, which is burning me out a little. Do I sound cranky? So part of it is you have to be able to say no. Individuation relates to boundaries as well. Sometimes the most difficult thing for people in ministry is you usually get into it because you're good with people and you're a people pleaser. So really, really a lot of discomfort with disapproval. But you have to get used to it, because the more you grow in capacity, the more people you're not going to please. So it's very important. I have lots of pastor stories in terms of therapy. I had two pastors, I usually tell this story, came in and they both went severely in debt. And the one got caught by his congregation. He had $110,000 in debt and nobody knew about it. Half the congregation wanted to pay it off, half wanted him fired. The half that wanted him fired won in the long run. But he came to me for therapy in the meantime. He was a really wonderful guy. He was afraid to tell people he couldn't live on the salary that they were giving him. So he didn't tell them. So he just cranked up the debt. The other one was a pastor that had $50,000 in debt, and this is like a long time ago. His wife didn't know he was doing it. So she made him come to therapy. And it's basically issues of individuation. I'm afraid to be selfish. Who are you afraid to be selfish around? If you have somebody, you're usually too dependent on them and not dependent on God enough, is what we would say in ministry. You have to be more dependent on God than you are on any person. So if God tells you to do something, somebody else doesn't like it, you got to do it anyway. Amen? But that's hard, very difficult at times. Okay, so this happens with business leaders. I have business leader stories and political leaders stories. I'm going to give you one other pastor story in terms of this. Oftentimes we as pastors sacrifice our wives on the altar of service. And part of that is what we get rewarded for, they don't. So the burden, if you go back to that, is on them without the capacity or without the blessing or the reward. So one of my worst ones was about 25 years ago that and Glenn will probably address this a little more than me, but in big churches you have more resources. In startup businesses, startup churches, you're oftentimes very dependent on the people just because of the dynamic. So this guy was making huge sacrifices, and in his salary, he was not turning the heat on in the winter here, and they had 3 little kids. And he lived in a part of Tucson that it was very cold. And so about once every 3 months, she would meet me at the office with her car packed, ready to leave him. And I would talk her out of leaving him, but he felt threatened by that. So he would call me and say I was having an affair with his wife. And what he was saying is, I don't really get along with her because she won't hop on my cross with me or the altar with me. So I'd have him in, but we didn't bond quite as well. And she did that 3 times in 2 years of therapy. Showed up with the car packed, was going to leave. And so he didn't know that I was really protecting him. But it was very, very difficult because all of her sacrifices came without reward. When he did those sacrifices, he was like Jesus. He was taking up the cross. He was making huge sacrifices for the congregation. They admired him, and she was just cold and trying to protect children that were cold. So part of that is the way this works. And the three things that I'm going to finish with is the consequences of not doing self-care are that there's loss of physical health. I've had businessmen that have been so sick they had to quit their work and could not do anything for a year. I call that a forced Sabbath. They did not have a choice about taking a break. They had to take a break. Loss of mental health and loss of relational health. So those things are the consequences of a lack of self-care. Glenn and I were talking about it before, that what happens is when people have a lot of passion and vigor, they don't realize that these things are coming. And if they don't do something about them, and I'm guilty, June's not here. I told her she can't come and tell our story. But, especially when you're young, you're fervent, you're passionate, and you oftentimes overlook the consequences of not taking care of yourself. And it's kind of normalized. Suffering's normalized. Pushing yourself over your limits is normalized. And what it is they're not really balancing with self-care. So I'm going to come back up after Glenn comes, but that's more than enough information, I think, for the time that I have. I appreciate Glenn Elliott. He's you call yourself senior pastor? Lead pastor of Pantano Christian. And Glenn and I have known each other for a long time. His wife worked for me, so she knows more of my shortcomings than most people. You get very close when you work with somebody. So Glenn knows those as well. And we have had a lot in common for a long time in our connections, and I appreciate Glenn and all that he does. Some of his hobbies, some of his self-care are similar to mine. And when I heard him last time, I thought, you guys need to hear what he does and how the church supports that, because you need a healthy system. And I'll mention it just one more time. Some of you are in systems that are not healthy. And you can complain against it, but that probably is not going to do anything, because you're responsible for your own happiness. When Jesus says you have to count the cost, he's putting the onus on you to take care of yourself. So that's difficult because we want to put it back on God, and we can to some extent. But if you're in an unhealthy system, you're in an unhealthy system, and you may not get the love and support for you taking care of yourself well. So Glenn's a good example of self-care, so I'm going to have him share.
So in June, I celebrated 40 years of full-time, uninterrupted ministry. 40 years is a long time. And that was more fanfare than I got any of the time when that happened. I wrote a blog and I did a Facebook post. I had a couple people say congrats, but nothing. And that was 40 years of stress, conflict, lots of conflict. I counted it out, probably about 1,800 Sundays and all that entails. I really do believe that being a pastor is one of the hardest jobs in the world. Okay, being president of the U.S. is for sure, but there's only one of them. It's a hard work, and for me, the accomplishment of 40 years is that I managed those 40 years without burning out. That's the accomplishment. I avoided a nervous breakdown, and it wasn't just. No. And and I'll just say that for being 40 years at this place where I look younger than I am and to have tons of energy, it wasn't luck. It doesn't just happen. Most of us here, most of the time, experience these kinds of things. We are tired. Most people in ministry at some time go through some significant levels of depression. Randy can affirm all this. He's counseled about every one of the pastors here in Tucson. We have been drained. We have had our joy robbed. We've been lonely. We've been misunderstood terribly. We've been discouraged. We struggle with insecurity. We feel like we're failures. And sometimes we get to the place where we just feel like we're dying. And that is most of us a lot of the time. And if you've been in leadership, whether in church or in business, there are days when you honestly think, and if I'm the only one, I'll own it. But there are days that actually working at Walmart 8 to 5 seems really attractive. I have had those days I thought, I would like to be the greeter at Walmart. And just smile. Burnout is real. Randy and I don't want to use names, but it happens here in Tucson all the time. It just happened, and it will happen. And here's the thing, and stats prove this out. Experts in burnout will tell you this. When a person gets to the level of burnout, and I have talked to pastors who have gone through burnout, and they will affirm this. Once you get to the place of burnout, it's almost impossible to recover. It's not like you get to that point and go, oops, let's do a restart. It rarely happens. And furthermore, in burnout, almost always, there are exceptions, but almost always, the burnout is preceded or followed by moral failure. And the pastor gets fired for moral failure when the real issue was that was just one of the symptoms of the burnout. Now, that's not to excuse it. Don't hear me say that. But that's just the reality. So it's that serious. And none of us are immune from burnout. It's not, none of us are exempt from it. And so we've got to look at prevention, because it's too late afterwards. And by too late, I don't mean that you're done, you don't have any value to God or His kingdom, but you're not going to ever really recover. So it's all about prevention in every way. And prevention not only protects us from burnout, but here's the deal. If we really put some things into practice to help prevent burnout, that's when we really thrive. And that's what we want. We want to live lives where we're thriving and there's energy and there's real health there. And so I've really come in my 40 years of ministry to this place. I think the greatest need in the church and the kingdom of God, okay, I really believe this, is health. We need healthy churches. Healthy churches will grow. Healthy churches will have an impact in the community, but we need healthy churches. And we won't have healthy churches unless we have healthy leaders. We won't have healthy churches unless we have healthy leaders. And no one else is responsible for my health. Right? I'm responsible. That doesn't mean others can't help me. I'll get to that. But I'm ultimately responsible for my health. And therefore, I'm ultimately responsible for the health of the church and creating the systems of health, not only for my life, but for the church. And I won't get into the whole church piece of that. So we're responsible for our inside health. And the challenge in this is that, and Randy talked about that fancy word, individuation. And I believe that it's that inability to take care of ourselves that not only results in our own unhealth, but the unhealth of our church. I just said at our table, I'll just quickly say, most churches will not grow past 200. You know why? It's because the pastor refuses to let go of responsibility. He's going to be at every hospital call. He's going to do every counseling session. He's going to take care of every major initiative. He's got to be in the middle of that because it's his need. And when he does that, he doesn't empower others to lead. And he's worn out, so he doesn't have the time and the energy to equip others, which, by the way, the last time I read Ephesians chapter 4, that's our job, to equip others. And so what happens is the church maybe starts to grow because the person's really a nice person, gets to 200, but now he is stressed out, has no energy left, and then it goes back to 180. It happens over and over. And then what eventually will happen is not only is the church not healthy, but he burns out or she burns out. And so this is why this is so important. So there's a lot that Randy and I could talk about. I just want to share with you three things that are just critical for me. There's more, but these are the three. And I want to start with the one that's, I think, most important. It's the concept of Sabbath. Here's the problem we have with Sabbath. We don't have a theology of Sabbath. We are the New Testament church. Jesus and the apostles repeated 9 of the 10 commandments, right? What's the commandment that was never repeated as a commandment in the New Testament? The Sabbath. We even saw Jesus said, who cares about the Sabbath? Eat grain on the Sabbath. Jesus even said, the Sabbath wasn't made for man. Man wasn't made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. And so we have this theology that says, the Sabbath isn't important because it's not, because the Old Testament Sabbath was a sign of the Old Covenant. That's what your scripture says in Exodus. So we've dismissed it. It's not a requirement as a law. But God made Sabbath for the man because the principle of rest is still true. God worked 6 days and he rested. And when you read Exodus chapter 20, I think it starts in about verse 3 or 4, it says that the Sabbath is holy unto the Lord. This principle of rest is absolutely essential to our well-being. And we have a horrible theology of Sabbath. And then you get to the New Testament. Take some time, maybe for your devotion tomorrow, to read Hebrews chapter 4. It's all about the theology of rest. And it's actually not an easy read, but it's there. And we've just dismissed all of that. And here's what the Sabbath is. This was the Sabbath idea. We need 24 hours of non-production. Now, that doesn't mean you don't do anything but just sit on a couch for 24 hours. But you know what production is in your work life. We need 24. Now, again, it's not a law. There are weeks when breaks loose and you don't get your Sabbath, and it's not like your life is over. But if we have a consistent system of Sabbath, of 24 hours of non-production, that's what brings the rest. And remember, all the vital spiritual disciplines, you take any book on spiritual disciplines, every spiritual discipline is leading us to the same place, making room for God. When I'm producing, God gets pushed, even though I'm doing it for God. We need that 24 hours of non-production. Most of my life, I have failed in this area, that I have tried to work to keep my 1 day of Sabbath, and I've had 1 day off. I've learned I can't do that, because you know what happens when you only have 1 day set aside for Sabbath? It inevitably gets interrupted because somebody's going to die. Somebody's going to get married. There's a conference. We host a conference. It's going to be Friday, August 11th. Friday's my day off. Yeah. And so we've moved now to where I can have 2 days off a week. I am so selfish. 2 days off a week. I waited way too long to do that. I'm telling you that now because those of you who are younger, don't wait to figure that out. Now, does it mean that you never ever can violate that? No, that's not a law. That you have a system to do that. So, what do I do on my Sabbath? Sometimes I like to do landscaping. You say, well, that's production. I'm not doing it for the church. I just like to do a project and see it done and go, that looks good. Sometimes woodworking. I own a boat, and I'm not afraid to tell my congregation I own a boat. Now, it's not fancy. Have rebuilt the motor. I've redone everything on it except the hull. But I love to go to the lake. The worst day on the lake is better than any day in the church. I love bringing people with me. I have gotten to have more incredible conversations and developed amazing relationships because you have all this time. And so and then when it's winter and too cold to water ski, I snow ski. If it's got skis, I want to do it. And I have to make that time to do it. It's absolutely essential. It can be, we're all different. What's fun for you? You say, I don't do anything fun. That's a problem. That's that selfish thing. Like, well, Christians can't have fun. Baloney. Or other words. We've got to have hobbies. And it doesn't matter what the hobby is as long as it's legal and ethical, you know. What do you like to do? I just talked to a pastor who's gone through burnout, and that's part of his whole process is he's trying to discover what's his hobbies, what's that he's going to do besides the church thing. And it's really been hard for him to figure that out. We got to figure those things out. One of our staff, they use their Sabbath day every week to go to a movie together. You know, they've seen every movie ever made, I think. It doesn't matter what it's doing outdoors. For me, sometimes of the year, I just love to go hike. Just love being outdoors. All of that is rest. All of that. And boy, I'll tell you what, it's amazing what God does in me in those true Sabbath days. And then, so here's my system of Sabbaths. It's not just that. I think we have to have a system of Sabbaths. And again, I am not perfect in these all the time, every day, every week, every year, but I really do work to develop these. One is a daily Sabbath. You know, in the Christian church, we call that the quiet time. Where's that time? And sometimes for me, by the way, it's in the morning. Sometimes it's in the evening. Depending on the day, it works both for me. Where's that time where I just quiet the day for whatever amount of time that is, minutes, just to say, God, I love you. And reading God's word, prayer, all of that, daily. So I think we need a daily Sabbath. And then the weekly Sabbath, I talked about that. 24 hours of non-production. And again, not legalistic like the Pharisaical Jews. 24 hours of not doing church work or whatever your business or employment is. And then monthly. I require our staff to take a day off every month. And I don't define how they use it. They can go away and pray. They can just read a book if they want. I don't care. But I want them to every month just to say, because here's the deal. And this is why the Sabbath was so hard for the Jews. Is think of it, that was an agrarian culture. So if you don't go out and plow the field or harvest, or feed the cattle or the pigs or they didn't have pigs, the sheep, you know, whatever. And if they had pigs, they were in trouble. That cost you. That really cost you. And really what happens in the Sabbath is, do I really trust that God is God? Pastors, we say this, and church leaders, we say this. Church doesn't belong to me, it belongs to God. Really? Do we really believe it belongs to Him? That I can take a day off and He's going to manage it okay? That it all won't fall apart? You know, that's why this is so critical. It really says I'm going to trust God to be God. So, and then I do a yearly Sabbath. This one is absolutely essential to me. I generally now take June off. We create a very generous vacation policy at our church, and so I'm able to take the month of June off. I don't preach. In fact, I went 7 weeks this year without preaching. Had different people come in, had different staff. Our congregation loved it. fact, the series that 4 of them did in June when I was gone was maybe one of the best series we ever did. I'm not threatened by that. When I come back after 4 weeks and everybody says, man, they were great, I'm going, yes, because I don't want to come back and go, oh, it was so bad. Because then I'm going to not enjoy being off the next time, right? And so I spent a week at the lake. I did projects around the house. I got up when I wanted to get up. I did whatever I wanted to. I unplugged for 4 weeks. And when I was going into June, I was exhausted. We have a congregation running about 2,600, several campuses. I'm exhausted. I'm involved in Fort Tucson. I'm involved in all kinds of things. By June, I was exhausted. I came out of June. My tank was full. I was ready to go. And I'll be good for another year. And I'll be exhausted by next June. With some other vacation time in there, but I know I need that time. You don't have to copy how I do it. We're all different. We're all individual, but we've got to have a system of Sabbath. And so that's the most important thing. Next thing, we got to have connections. Human connection. 85% of all pastors in the most recent survey I read have no close friends. 85%. I wonder if that parallels with the same stat that 85% of all churches are plateaued and dying. Maybe an interesting parallel there. We got to have connections, and that takes work. And so I just will tell you that. So let me speak to the pastors, but this applies to every area of life. Our role as lead or senior pastor, or as the pastor of the church, is unique. It has unique stresses that nobody else even can fully understand. Your board, your staff, if you have a staff, your congregation will not understand the pressures that you face. They just won't. Not that they're mean or don't want to, they just can't. And so that's why I want to challenge you to do what we've been doing here in Fort Tucson, is that's be a part of what we call a covenant group. Right here in this room are several of my covenant partners. I have 2 covenant groups on the east side of East Side pastors. We get together every month. We have dinner, we have lunch together. We share our lives together. And it goes beyond that. We know each other. I have people I can go to when I'm struggling, who I absolutely trust, who would never betray me, who I'm not in competition with. And I hope they're not in competition with me. Okay, that's essential. You have to create that. So maybe you don't feel comfortable. Maybe you don't have those friends I believe you can have friends in your church. I don't think it has to be outside of your church. But maybe for whatever reason you're not comfortable with that. There are other pastors in the city that also need to be in those relationships. And we'll be glad to help you create and form those and tell you how to do them. It's not complicated at all. But you've got to have those connections. Without that, you will not be healthy. I think Dan, you had said this, Dan was in our group until he retired. Way to go. I think Dan said, without this group, I wouldn't have survived. And that's true. Because we face challenges. We got questions. Who do you talk to about this stuff? That way. So, and here's the last thing, and that's just, this is a hard issue. We got to ask ourselves the question, which could be a selfish question. How's your heart? How's your heart? How's your soul, if you like that theology better? We don't ask that question enough. Can I answer? My heart is really healthy. Not perfect. None of us here have a perfect heart. That isn't going to happen this side of eternity. But is my heart really healthy? And if the answer is no, you got to pay attention to it, because it doesn't fix itself. It doesn't just happen. You got to do it. Some great books if you want help. Randy can give you a whole list of them. One of them that I just finished was Replenish, Leading from a Healthy Soul by Lance Witt, W-I-T-T. Replenish. How do you replenish? Leading from a healthy soul. That's really what it's all about. And so there's some ideas. I'm glad to share with you some others in that. But that's the Sabbath and having real connections where you can really be real and be genuine. I talked to a pastor recently who went through burnout, and I said, did you talk to anybody? He said, yeah, nobody listened. Nobody took me seriously. I said, what? His board didn't really listen to how serious this was. His best friend didn't listen to him. Maybe couldn't. Maybe it was his own, who knows why. But you got to have people that when you say, I am in trouble, you got people that'll go, all right, what are we going to do? What do we need to, who are with you on that, who want to really listen to understand. The same person said, nobody understood. I tried to explain it, nobody understood. So, Sabbath, connections, and then asking the question, how's your heart? Right?